Hello, welcome to the second installment of these live videos that I'll be doing. Thank you for waiting on me. I know I was a few minutes late here. So I was thinking we'd just pick up back where we left off last night and get into chapter 4. So chapter 4 is called Mocking. And in chapter 4, we're getting to know a little bit more about the new world that Lauren's living in. So she and her, she met Brian in the last chapter, so we discussed that. So now here she is, moving into their first date with him. So that's what this chapter is kind of outlining as their first date. And they decide to go into town, they will go into town, but before they get there, they go down to a creek to do some skipping stones. And that was one of the ways that Brian was able to kind of lure Lauren in, was this very sweet, very innocent activity. And she was allured by that. So I'm going to do a reading right off because it picks up where they're at down by the stream. They stayed another hour or more. Brian skipped multiples every time. Lauren was consistently getting one skip out, but never did get two. They giggled and wooed the whole time. Lauren was falling in love, which tended to happen quickly for her, though not like this. Lauren sensed something different about Brian. He was unlike anyone she'd ever been with. He so unambiguously wanted her, and his heavy innuendo wasn't said with vulgarity. He was a fine enough looking man, but it was his energy that was striking. She felt as if she'd known him her entire life in just a few short hours. Lauren could feel his edge. She just didn't think that it would cut. They decided to head down and pick up a snack from one of the stalls along the main strip. The town was dominated by the towering architectural beauty of the clinic. And for those of you, just as a side note, this book is set in Rochester, so the clinic would be one of our medical institutions here. The mostly empty, well-guarded building stood mocking those below, reminding everyone of what had been lost. The clinic had been a flagship medical organization for generations, but when one pay structure after another folded in quick succession, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance companies, they couldn't sustain the weight of the apparatus they had built, let alone find enough doctors and nurses, since many had been immigrants who could no longer get visas. China became the global leader of innovation with Russian backing. Since China believed that their star could only rise if America's burned out, they were largely behind the international conspiracy to elect the American president. The Russian dictator and the Chinese dictator were both keen to destabilize the country, and sabotaging democracy was an easy way to accomplish this task. Russia became a happy lapdog to China's egregious juggernaut, so long as their dictator could keep raking in mob cash, while letting his own people starve. Everywhere the Chinese dictator's influence rose, oppression and imprisonments followed, including in the United States. So I guess I forgot when I selected that that we're not spending a lot of time with Lauren and Brian down by the creek, but we did start out with that. So, that section of the novel that I just read was reflective of a couple of ideas that I was having at the time. So one of the concerns that many people have with our medical situation is that we don't have an adequate system to cover medical expenses for our citizens. And so in this world, as the economy is continuing to collapse, these government structures that really have been helping to prop up the medical system in this country, Medicaid, Medicare, like I said, those are starting to falter because, again, we have a president who cares and a president and a party who care very little about the people and their well-being, and so funding these massive social programs is no longer a priority. And we're already seeing that a little bit with, for example, the Affordable Care Act is coming into the Supreme Court soon. So that has been a very controversial law, and for some folks it did raise their health insurance costs and make things more difficult. But for many, many people, it did lower costs, or at least keep them from rising as rapidly, because we had really spiraling healthcare costs before that. We still have spiraling healthcare costs. What am I talking about? In any event, so these systems for paying for the healthcare were reducing over time. And so then we see a lot of these large institutions that are just kind of crumpling under their own weight, because they don't have the capacity to fund everything without government help. So that was partially why I put that in there. I also want to talk a little bit about international politics again. We talked about that last night some. So, I make some pretty pointed comments in here about China and Russia. And, those were a little hard to put in there because, clearly there's been no report that's come out that has clearly identified these connections that I was making. This kind of started to come to mind, I don't know, over the last couple of years. I've been sort of wondering, are China and Russia going in on things together? There were just too many things that were seeming a little suspicious to me about their behavior around different things in international politics. So then that is one of the very, very few aspects of this book that I really had to do a research on. So I started digging into it and digging, and there are actually a fair number of scholars who would support that version of events, that China and Russia are very physically connected to each other. China is definitely ascendant for a wide variety of reasons, and Russia never will achieve that level of ascendancy again. And I think Vladimir Putin knows this. Their infrastructure is not the greatest, and he's stealing so much money from the country. They don't even have any capacity to build it up again or anything. So Russia really is declining as a nation, and continues to decline as a nation, unfortunately, for the people of Russia. And so I also wanted to bring in the concept of mob connections. So, this is something that I think is sometimes looked at as almost as if more of a conspiracy theory than a reality, but there actually is very solid evidence of Putin's connection to the mafia or to the Russian mafia, and I alluded to that in the last one about him being the richest man in the world. And so I think we have to be aware that yes, you have governments, but governments can have criminal ties. And I very much believe that the Russian government is very tied to the criminal state. And this isn't just my belief. I did do quite a bit of research on that. So that's why I kind of put that in there. They've been pretty slick about it, because if you don't pay close attention, you could think that China and Russia were still enemies. And I'm not saying they're best friends or anything, but I do think that there are closer ties between those countries, and efforts to destabilize our democracy that they have combined with. So do your own research on that if that's something that you're not certain about, but I became pretty convinced of it after the research I did on that subject. So let's see, what else do we got in this chapter? So we've got, okay, so here's the other big thing I want to talk about in this chapter. So Lauren is falling for Brian. Brian is, so they get together on this date, and they head down to Bear Creek, and they're, skipping stones, and then they decide to go into town. And what I'm trying to build in this chapter is the concept of how effective what am I trying to say? How effective a narcissist is, or an abusive person is, at manipulating their victim and bringing them in. So throughout the entire novel, I was trying to really address that subject, because what we find is that people with narcissistic personality disorder, they are able to bring people in a way. I mentioned last time, they're often more emotionally in tuned to people and understanding how to manipulate. And so Brian is very in tuned to how to manipulate Lauren, how to get what he wants from Lauren. And so one of the early techniques that a narcissist will use is to do what's called kind of almost like mirroring. So Lauren and Brian go into town, back up at the creek, he's very complimentary. He's very chivalrous, very, gentle and sweet and kind. And Lauren is seeing this as like, oh, this is this really nice man finally after all this time, all these terrible relationships. Unable to identify the ways in which there's red flags still. So even a narcissist, no matter how effective they are at their initial grooming stage, there's always going to be tells. Lauren is missing these tells. I don't write a lot of tells into it, but a few. Then they go into town, and then there's more tells. For instance, everything Lauren looks at, Brian is like, oh, very interested as well. And that's another tell with a narcissistic or abusive relationship, is that they're overly interested in what you're interested in. So there's not a lot of authenticity. But in the beginning, for someone who is entering this type of relationship, it feels very much like simpatico, so they are in sync with each other. And so, Lauren is just completely swept up in this, this concept of how much he seems to love her and want her. So, but through the chapter, we start then to build into the concept that this is an artifice of Brian's. He doesn't truly love Lauren. No narcissist can truly love another. So, we then start seeing his techniques to break her down and to bring her into his world and kind of deconstruct her capacity to question and to understand what is happening in the relationship. So, and in part why I wanted to do that is because, to build in these concepts is because what we are seeing, across the board with these wannabe dictators is almost all of them are dealing with some form of narcissism, some sort of narcissistic personality disorder. And they almost all follow a fairly similar playbook. They tell you what you want to hear, not necessarily what, especially in the beginning, not necessarily what is the truth. They're always going to put out, a version of themselves. It's what they want you to see. But then they almost all devolve into very similar techniques, whether it's an interpersonal relationship, whether it's a cult type situation. Like I mentioned last time, I'm obsessed with learning about cults. There's so many cults. You would not even, I never knew how many cults there were. There's so many. But they almost all have this narcissistic person at the helm. And so, through these, there's a lot of through lines between interpersonal relationships and the way a narcissistic leader will deal with their people. It's a very, very similar dynamic. We have, profound gaslighting, attempting to reframe reality in their way. Truth no longer has relevance in this, for a narcissist. You don't need to, truth is, I've given a lot of thought to this because I've known a lot of people who've lied, excessively, at the drop of a hat. In fact, almost every word comes out of their mouth you're sort of skeptical of. And I used to, I think I've come to a conclusion on this myself, but I used to question, did they believe what they're saying? And in my opinion, I'm not a psychologist, but what it feels to me is if what happens is there's some psychological disjuncture that truth is not even a relevant concept to them. It's whatever they want to say at that moment. And they believe it at that moment. They very much believe it, which is why they often can come across as sincere or so sincere. So, I kind of wanted to bring in that lying, that gaslighting, that manipulation at a micro level, an interpersonal level. as a way to also explore how a leader can also be narcissistic and gaslighting and basically abusive to their people. So that was a big theme for me throughout the novel. So by the end of this chapter, we're definitely, Lauren is completely sucked in. Brian is, showing his true colors. Another thing that we have here, and this is something important to note, another technique of abusive people, is that they often create such a sense of camaraderie or security or what have you in their victim that the victim is willing to divulge personal information and other things that can be used against them later. And so we see at the end of this chapter, or not in the end of this chapter, but towards the middle of the chapter, Lauren really, when she's first interacting with Brian, she really opens up to him. She, expresses some things or allows him to interact with her in a way that she wouldn't normally let someone. And of course, then that comes back to bite her. Let's see. Okay, this is this chapter. Why was I thinking this wasn't this chapter? So we also, this is a heavy chapter. This was a hard chapter for me to write. So the reason it was so difficult was because another thing I wanted to address in this novel was the concept of sexual assault and sexual violation of norms. And part of the reason for that is that, we're living in a really interesting time when it comes to awareness of sexual assault and sexual crimes against people. And unfortunately, I think it's kind of become co-opted and shifted around a little bit. But, certainly with the Me Too movement, there's more awareness of the intensity of some of these manipulators and how they can get away with what they're doing. Jeffrey Epstein's, the Weinsteins, all of these guys. So many of them, whose last names don't end in Stein. So we're seeing that, really becoming part of the cultural conversation in a way that it hasn't before. And then I think particularly after Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, there was a palpable sense among many women in particular survivors of sexual assault, that they were almost being mocked. It's the title of my chapter, unrelated, but almost as if, their concerns or their capacity, their own capacity to remember what has happened in their lives was being questioned. And that Dr. Ford was really raked over the coals. And, I don't know if many of you know this, but, after all of her testimony, she had to move. She had to take a leave of absence from her job. She was receiving many death threats. I don't know what's happened to her now. I worry about that. But, I think for many people it felt like a re-victimization. And so, I think in the way that the assault happened in that description that Dr. Ford brought up, and that many of the victims in the Me Too movement were coming forward with stories of, I think these were, I think sometimes people can dismiss the stories for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons that I have noticed, or one of the things I have noticed, it's shifting a little bit, but it's still, I think, very much a part of our culture, is we tend to think of rape and sexual assault still as the stranger in the woods who jumps out and grabs the lady and, does this thing. And we tend to think of the woman as, she should be, if she doesn't want it, she should be fighting, she should be screaming, she should be protesting, she should, never speak to that man again if he did that thing to her. And I think it's sexual assault and rape are so much more complicated than that depiction. And so I wanted to write a scene that was more reflective, I think, on many women's experiences with sexual assault, that it's and rape, that it's not the stranger, that it isn't necessarily violent, and that she doesn't necessarily always understand what happened afterward, nor do I think sometimes the men fully comprehend what they've done and how that played out. So that was partially why a different version of the novel had a lot more about the rapist and kind of his mentality at the time. I had to cut that out. But, essentially in this scene, what we have is, Lauren's a teenager, and she sneaks out and meets this guy who she's, into, and and then he has sex with her, and she has never even kissed anyone, let alone had sex. And so she was not in a place where this was something she wanted, but she snuck out, and she was drunk, and she was there with him, and she let him kiss her, and it was just, in her own mind, she couldn't really piece together what had happened afterward. And that's really the crystallizing event that shatters my character's psyche, is that she's so wounded by what took place and her inability to process it emotionally, that she kind of shuts down afterwards. And so that separates her from her family. She as a person changes quite a bit. She also loses herself in the sense that she no longer really feels like the conductor of her own train. There's a part of her that's been taken that she can't get back, and she doesn't understand how or why exactly. All she knows is that she's broken from the event. So I'm going to read a little bit of this too. And this is then, okay, this isn't about the sexual assault. So then the chapter, or the section I'm going to read here from that same chapter, is about suicide. So let's talk about that for a second. So suicide is also a really significant theme in the novel. And, it is for a number of reasons. One, we're seeing just vast numbers of people taking their own lives in all age groups, but particularly it's increasing among young people. And suicide has touched me very strongly in my life. My uncle killed himself when I was 15. One of my best friends, Ben, who some of you may be watching this would know, killed himself when he was just 18. And other friends and things of that nature. And so, suicide has such a kind of a stigma to it in terms of like addressing the fact that people can feel suicidal. The amounts of people who feel suicidal are actually really, really broad. And so, I wanted to kind of highlight suicide as a social problem that we need to be thinking about a little bit. But because of Lauren's rape, really suicide has become something that's, one of her best friends, or the concepts of suicide is something she has been somewhat obsessed with since this attack. She thinks about it a lot. But in the past, it had been more wanting to die versus wanting to kill herself. So with Brian and the abuse, what we're seeing is that he wears her down to the point where it shifts from like, I want the pain to end and I want to be released, to I actually want to kill myself. So here we're gonna get into that. For those of you on Instagram, I posted a picture of the knife that inspired this little scene. Okay. When she was young, she'd sneak over to the decaying turkey barns that had bankrupted the grandpa she had never known. Her mom didn't like her to be there, since it was the spot that he'd put a bullet through his heart. Lauren would lie in the grass between the tall, round buildings where no one could see her. The wind would whip through the hollow buildings, and she would imagine herself being carried up in the gusts and blown away. to nothing. She wanted to disappear more than to die. Nowadays, death itself has a singular appeal. She sometimes went into the kitchen and opened the drawer to gaze at the thin, curved blade of her tomato knife. Lauren would run her finger along the razor-sharp tip as she imagined it slipping perfectly into her jugular. She'd wince against the pain and then feel the release. She could hide the wound without Brian suspecting. He'd found the scars on her inner thigh, where as a girl she'd slice neat rows, just to remember that she was real. Brian had yelled at her. He told her that she was weak. Of the insults Brian leveled at her, this was the one that hurt the most. She may have been many things, but she was not weak. Sometimes she felt the only reason she stayed alive was to deny him the satisfaction of her demise. Lauren wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing why she had ever started cutting herself. It all started from a single event, an event that she would try to tell herself was no big deal but would take her a lifetime to untangle. One of the few solid truths that Lauren could hold on to in her life was that after that night she was different, no matter how Eric explained it to the kids at school. So there we see, kind of the progression of her suicidal ideation, and that's when we then get into that rape scene. So sorry, that was a big spoiler for those of you who haven't read it yet, but it's difficult to talk about the book without spoilers, so sorry. Okay, so yeah, that chapter was really personal and really challenging to write. That scene stayed relatively similar throughout the writing of the novel, but it was one I edited many times. So as I said yesterday, kind of living in that world, this novel, was not always the easiest place to be. So anyway, okay, moving on. Let's go on to Chapter 5. We're going to go a little quicker clip tonight, folks. Chapter 5, Innumerable Particles. So in this chapter, excuse me, we're seeing that Brian has now successfully worn Lauren down. She is a shell of herself. She's no longer able to stand her ground. And the gaslighting and the lying and the manipulation and all of these things, the name calling, just the constant drumbeat of negativity and abuse from Brian has just gotten her to where she doesn't even really know who she is anymore, and she can't really break out of the turmoil, the emotional turmoil she's in with Brian, because part of what happens, I think, for those folks who are in abusive relationships, I think we as a culture, or if you've never been in an abusive relationship, it's very easy to be super judgmental. Like, well, how can they be so stupid? How can they stay? And so that was one of the things I wanted to portray with Lauren as well, is that, how was she able to stay? Well, the way that people stay in abusive relationships is because when it starts out, it's not abusive. It's wonderful. And that's what the narcissist knows. And that's what they do, is they pull you in and suck you in emotionally at a level, you feel super warm and fuzzy. This is like this really good situation that you want to last, you want to stay. And it isn't as if the abuser becomes an obviously abusive person overnight. They do these subtle things that shift the dynamic over time. So like we saw in the last chapter, Brian's starting to do things. One of the biggest things that abusers will do is to say cruel things and then say it's a joke, or to say not necessarily cruel, but, just whatever they want to say, no matter what it is. If the person is offended by it or upset by it, no, it's a joke. You just don't know how to take a joke. So that's the way it started out with Lauren, was, that Brian was, he wasn't being abusive, that she just had a thin skin. So that starts to set the stage for someone to question themselves, because they're like, oh, well, yeah, maybe they were joking and I don't have a sense of humor. And once that questioning of yourself starts, it just kind of keeps cascading. So, and then the person who was in the abusive relationship is often desperate to get back to that place that it was in the beginning, where things were good and warm and happy. and they feel as if internally, and partially reinforced by the abuser, that they've done something wrong, that's why the abusive relationship is the way it is. And the abuser, yes, will definitely reinforce that. You're stupid, you're weak, you're immature, whatever. So we've got Lauren pretty much broken down. I don't spell out exactly how long they were together, but a year, 2 years, something in that general area. And when Lauren first gets together with Brian is not part of the militia, and he's not part of, he's really not religious or, necessarily all that openly racist, maybe a little racist, but, nothing over the top or anything. So the other thing we're seeing in the progression of this chapter is that as Brian becomes more abusive, the more he's involved with this militia. So I'm naming the militia, ironically, Defenders of the Homeland, because many of these patriot militia groups consider themselves folks who are saving the Constitution. Unfortunately, few of them have read the Constitution, understand the Constitution. None of that, but, they think they are. So these folks are defending the homeland, right? So in any event, sorry, I'm seeing a little fighting on my stream. Ladies, I don't know what's all going on. Let's chill out. In any event, so, back row. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. In any event, Lauren is pretty much broken by Brian by this point. So I thought I would pick up with where Lauren. So I don't want to. In an earlier version of the novel, I spent a little bit more time, or quite a bit more time, kind of going on about kind of the dynamics of the abusive relationship. I cut out a lot of that, and now we're going to get back to more quickly. Lauren starting to regain herself. So she, broken down, but then here we're going to come into the scene after something really awful has happened. Brian has really taken his mistreatment of her to another couple levels, and something happens, and she's really blown away by it, really sad. And she's out in her barn. She's taking care of her animals, and there's a terrible storm. So, okay. The harder the wall of water came down, the louder were her screams. She flipped off the deluge and stomped her feet like the child he was always accusing her of being. Droplets gathered on the dusty floor, soaking the fraying edge of her jeans. Lauren threw her head high and howled a vast, visceral cry, as if the pain in her voice could transform him into the person she thought he was, or change her into someone he might actually love. She dropped to her knees, smashing the ground until her fists were bruised and the rain dissipated. Exhausted, Lauren dusted herself off, finally ready to face Brian again. As she opened the door to her house, her blood turned to ice in an instant. He was sitting at the kitchen table looking straight at her. He was not in his recliner, and Lauren didn't know what was coming. She avoided eye contact as she took off her coat and boots. She steadied herself against the wall to wait. Brian's sarcastic voice split the silence. "You sure took your sweet time, didn't you? What were you doing out there?" "What do you mean? I was taking care of the animals. What do you think I was doing?" Lauren worried that he'd heard her yelling. She bit her lip. The veins pulsed in his neck. "I don't know, Lauren. But here's what I do know. You've been a real cunt lately. Thinking you can do whatever you want. Do you realize how lucky you are to have me? No one else could ever love you. Your own family didn't even love you, did they? Where's this sister of yours, huh? She's not here, Lauren, because she doesn't care. The reality is that I'm the only one who will ever love you, and I can barely stand you. You need discipline because, like all women, you're weak. You need leadership and a firm hand to show you the light. It's not your fault that I've been too lax. It's mine, Lauren." He came closer. Lauren held her breath. He grabbed her and pushed her against the wall by her throat. Lauren froze as neither fight nor flight were viable options. Brian pressed into the soft spot of her neck, and she was sure he would kill her. She closed her eyes as his spit spattered onto her face. What you need is to follow the rules of Sharia. Not the Muzzy Sharia, but our own version, white Sharia. Stephen's been telling me about it, and I'm convinced it's the secret to restoring harmony between us. God never meant for women to be so free. It makes a family unstable. It's in the Bible. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. There you go. Subjection. But suffer not a man to usurp authority. But suffer not a woman to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. It's time this household starts following the laws of God. So, I talked a lot in the last video about religious extremism. And so, clearly we're seeing an evolution of Brian becoming more extreme. So, in the realm of white nationalism, Christianity has gained this very high prominence, or at least their bastardized version of it. I don't want to insult Christians by claiming that this is Christianity, but their bastardized version of it has gained a very high prominence, and they use this as justification for much of what they do. So this whole white Sharia thing is not something I made up. So that was something I came across in some of my reading about militias. And I was really taken aback because I used that horrible slur, muzzy. I hate that. That is not my personal feelings. There's many horrible words I use in this book that are not in any way my opinions. But with these white nationalists, they hate Muslims so much. So what the fuck are you wanting to do Sharia for? This makes no sense to me. So I had to dig into that a little bit more. And what basically, it's the, and I'm not going to claim to have any, fully crystallized understanding of Sharia. I'm sure it's a very complex set of laws, religious laws. But we know that, extremist Muslims will use Sharia as justification for the oppression of women. So, these white nationalists have been like, hey, great, we don't agree with them on any other thing, but we can all agree that women should be oppressed, right? So that's why they've adopted this white Sharia concept, and it mirrors remarkably similar to the extremist Muslim version of Sharia. Women should be covered primarily, wearing very, very modest clothing, that women should not be able to do things like drive, vote, have jobs, these sorts of things. There should be no birth control or women's capacity to regulate their own lives. The men need to be in charge. So when I started digging into this concept a little bit more, it was really fascinating to me, the overlaps between almost every extremist religion and their desire to oppress women. I was like, yeah, these are all kind of coming together, aren't they? So, I think they're literally almost every extremist religion. I'm sure there's a few that probably don't. Actually, there were a few interesting cults that I read about that were, kind of like trying to buoy women's rights and stuff like that. Cults are strange. They've all got their own little mix of something. So I wouldn't say, I guess, uniformly, but I would say the vast majority of extremist religious groups, oppression of women is a very high priority. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm not sure what some of the folks who are more on the fringes of that movement would think about that, the kind of overlap with Islam, but I thought it was really fascinating. Okay, so now we're going to move ahead. Oh, no. I want to talk just briefly about something else. Okay, yeah, so I want to just quickly talk about the end of the chapter. So Lauren, we saw that scene in the barn. She's screaming and yelling, and then she comes in, of course, and is abused by Brian. And we should note that up to this point, Brian had not really been physically hurting her. It had been more just emotional abuse. So we've evolved in the level of abuse. And Lauren is just overwhelmed by it. She's just kind of at her breaking point now at this point. So after all this is going down, she's lying in bed, and Lauren she's an interesting person because she comes across as cold, she comes across as disinterested, shutting things out, not being willing to engage in kind of the horrible things that are happening in the country, and to acknowledge the things that her father and sister are telling her are going on. She makes excuses for the atrocities, and primarily she's doing this because, from the outside perspective, it could look like she's just a heartless person, but the reality for Lauren is that she is so tender, she's so soft, and she's so vulnerable and emotional, particularly after this, attack that she's never really been able to process the PTSD around, that she can't shut things out, so when things start getting to her emotionally, she just sort of, my dog was just sniffing the microphone, so if you heard that's what that was. Anyway, so she can't really deal with all of these emotions, so she shuts them all out, she blocks them. And at the end of this chapter, everything Brian has put her through, Lauren's finally breaking out of that. Like, she just can't continue to block all of her feelings anymore. So she has kind of this scene or this episode where she's, feeling her, because she's also been very good at blocking her own feelings. It's part of the way she's been with all these losers and doing all these things all these years, is she doesn't have a very good sense of what she feels or knowing herself. So she is finally starting to integrate some of this stuff into her life emotionally. So, I thought that was kind of some progress for Lauren. She's not the victim per se anymore. She's starting to claim, or at least a nugget of claiming of her own self. My dog, sorry. I have no young children here tonight, but I do have the dog. So these lovely things in my background, I'm going to explain these for a second, totally unplanned. These are sea urchin spines that were, I believe, purchased by my aunt for my grandmother many years ago, and these hung in my grandma's house when I was a little kid, and then in my mom's house, and then after my mother died, I became the inheritor of them. So that's what this little tinkly thing is in the background. Okay, so now let's, again, I said we're going a faster clip tonight, so we're already to move on to chapter 6. So chapter 6 is what he's capable of. And in this chapter, I shifted perspective. I've done that a few places in the novel where, Lauren is our main character, but where a chapter will be from somebody else's perspective or about somebody else. So chapter 6 is from Brian's perspective. And I wanted to do that for a variety of reasons. One, I know I've talked a lot about narcissists, but let's talk a little more about narcissists, shall we? So from my understanding of mental health challenges or disorders of different sorts, it's very, very rarely, we tend to, as popular culture, think of black or white. You either are or you're not. In my experience with so many different people in my life with serious mental health challenges, it's very rarely a one or the other. Usually it's some people fall somewhere on that spectrum, and I believe narcissism is no different. So you have people who are highly narcissistic, people who are very mildly narcissistic. Only the highly, in my understanding, only the highly narcissistic people are going to be virtually devoid of emotions. Almost anybody else who's on that spectrum, less than that, essentially more like the sociopathic level of narcissism, is going to have some tender feelings, some normal emotion, and even, I guess, even the psychopathic or sociologic or, sociopathic narcissist can still have some degree of normal attachment or normal feelings for people. And, narcissism develops from a variety of ways. That's the other thing we should kind of just talk about briefly. It can come into a person's life. There are folks who are just simply born that way. There's, there's not necessarily anything that happened in their lives, but they just kind of have that tendency to be narcissistic. Narcissism can also come about from early childhood trauma and abuse, and or neglect. So you don't even have to be abused like hit or anything necessarily, or called names, but profound neglect can also bring about personality disorders that really mirror narcissism. And actually our president, with his behavior, so many times I've thought about the people I know with the most severe reactive attachment disorder, which is the childhood traumatic abuse thing. So many of the children who I've parented have dealt with reactive attachment disorder because of their early childhood trauma. And the ways in which, the nonsense lying, the gaslighting, all of this, the name calling, the continual edge of, threats of like violent behavior and that type of thing. All of that was so similar and striking that I always wondered, did something happen to the president when he was little? Was he abused? What happened? And that's the way I think, because I don't see people as, cardboard cutouts. We're all very complex, and we have depth to us, even folks who maybe I don't really like that much. There's no secret I don't like the president. But that doesn't mean there isn't some degree of just human level empathy for him, particularly thinking about back as a child, because in my role as a parent to very challenging children, one of the things that I found most helpful was to look past the behavior at the moment, but to connect with the person who was mistreated, and that's why they are behaving that way. It didn't necessarily make it easier to experience the way that they were treating me, but it made it easier to empathize and to not get stuck and to not take it personally. That was a big thing, not taking it personally. So that is something I've been doing for many years now, about 20 years, this thought process of like, if there's this really difficult behavior or something, what happened in that person's life? Why are they that way? And trying to find some, find their dignity, find the empathy that I can have for them. And that includes the president. I mean, I know a lot of people would think I was insane for having a shred of empathy for President Trump, but I do. And so I thought, what happened to him? Was he born this way? And then, fascinatingly, this is just like a couple months ago, I read this story. His mother ended up having, I think it was a psychological breakdown. Having a psychological breakdown very shortly after, I don't remember all the exact facts, when he was little. So let's talk about reactive attachment disorder for a second, and how that can develop into this narcissistic personality disorder. That is almost always between the ages of 1 and 3 when that develops. So whatever this was with Trump's mother, it happened between the ages of 1 and 3. I remember that because it was matching up with the time frame where someone would have this trauma and how that could affect them for the rest of their lives. So his mother goes in the hospital. He's essentially abandoned, for all intents and purposes. If your mother is gone, you feel abandoned as a child. You don't understand why she's gone. And so, essentially abandoned by his mother. I'm not accusing his mother of abandoning, but because of her mental health issues, he ends up being separated from her for, I think it was like 5 months, which is really, really substantial in the life of a young child. And then apparently when she got home, she was never right again, that she was distant and cold and really kind of shut the children out. And so the part of me that cares about people and has worked with wounded children for so long. When I read that story, I definitely had some empathy for the president. You know, he didn't choose that situation, and people who go through that early separation from their caregiver, this type of personality disorder is very, very common. And what it happens is their brains rewire. So let's just try to understand the president. I hadn't anticipated talking about any of this. But it's like my worlds are coming together, my world with working with children and my politics. So what happens in the brain of someone who has experienced early trauma or separation from their caregiver is that your brain is still developing kind of what type of a your brain is still learning how to adapt to the world, okay? And so if you are born into a situation that's safe, loving, permanent, you know, you don't have loss of caregivers, you don't have any significant medical issues. That's another thing, is some people will develop this attachment disorder because they have significant medical issues as infants, and the continual pain and the surgeries and things like that, or you know, whatever the issue, can create some psychic divisions within them. But in any event, you know, the brain is still trying to figure out what the world is, what the world means before the age of 3. And if you have one of these significant events happen, not everyone who has one of these events will develop an attachment disorder or a narcissistic personality disorder, but a fairly high percentage of people will at least end up on that spectrum. And that is that their brain literally, physically wires itself as if you cannot trust the world, okay? So we are, you know, we're programmed, I guess, whatever, we've evolved, what have you, whatever words you want to use, to survive. We have very intense survival instincts, you know, particularly as infants. You know, we do all these things to bring our caregiver into our world, to take care of us because we are vulnerable. If the world is safe, like I said, you know, our brain is able to self in a way that says the world's safe, people are safe, people are good, we can trust. But if you have experienced, or you know, someone has experienced profound trauma of any sort before the age of 3, the brain can, and often does, rewire in a way that says the world is not a place you can trust. You need to be suspicious. You need to take care of you because no one else is going to take care of you. And that's where that narcissism comes in, or that overlap with narcissistic personality disorders, because they feel this almost existential threat to their survival by, you know, but they can't even necessarily explain it, you know, and that's the heartbreaking part of it. And you can rewire the brain some, you know, the brain is very plastic, but typically that happens through therapy and a lot of hard work, that the person finally comes to terms with the idea that this is where they're at. Many, many people don't. So I can't imagine the president ever sits around and thinks, wow, I lie so much, maybe I should quit lying. I don't think he's thinking that. But in order to overcome these things, you have to have your own internal motivation. And if you don't, you know, just forget it. So long journey to say, I do believe, you know, the president has some severe psychological issues. You know, his sister or his niece or whoever, who's the one who wrote that book, Mary Trump, you know, who is a psychologist, also is confirming this, you know. But I think, you know, I don't know. I just think understanding the origins sometimes of where people came to where they're at can be helpful. Doesn't mean it excuses behavior. It doesn't mean it makes us not hate everything that this man does. But maybe just adds just a tiny fraction of humanity back to him, because you know, you have seen just these very fleeting moments of him acting like a human being. Once in a while, he's capable of it. Okay. Oh, he's capable of it. What he's capable of. That was the chapter. So let's get into that. That's the reason why I wanted to give some from Brian's perspective, is Brian is a human, not a monster. He acts monstrously, but that doesn't mean he is himself a monster. And Brian has gone through some trauma, not this early childhood trauma necessarily. Well, there's a little bit, but Brian has been through some trauma. He's been through some bad stuff, and he felt like his world got shattered, and he feels lost. He doesn't quite know how to reconcile these internal feelings of inadequacy and insecurity with who he is now. And another thing we will find with people with narcissistic personality disorder, and I'm going to drop talking about reactive attachment disorder because that's more of what's considered a childhood condition, and narcissism can cross, can flow across a lot of these different diagnoses. So, for Brian, he he has this narcissism, but it doesn't mean that he's never loved anyone or cared about anyone. He has, in fact, a relatively close relationship with his grandmother who helped raise him. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was going to talk about insecurities. But often folks with narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic traits, I don't even think we have to go all the way to personality disorder. We can just say narcissistic traits. They're almost all going to share in common a vast, profound insecurity within themselves. And they're never going to be able to satisfy that insecurity. And much of their bravado, much of the way they speak to other people, the way they present themselves, is in order to attempt to fill that vacancy within their souls. So we'll see that a lot with the president, for example. My goodness, what normal person talks the way he does? I mean, I am the smartest person in the world. I have the best brain. I'm a stable genius. God, what else has he said? So many things, so many braggy things, constant, just like, I am the most amazing human being who's ever lived on the entire planet. And normal people don't talk like that because it's embarrassing, because we have social brains. Our brains are wired for social interaction. It would seem just ridiculous. I mean, I could not imagine sitting here saying those things to you in earnest. I can't imagine any of you watching this would say things like that in earnest. that's strange. It's disordered. It's an evidence of a disorder, I believe. So, we have, Brian, who is also, vastly insecure. Well, how do insecure people attempt to deal with their insecurity? Often it's through controlling everything around them. And it's through, intimidation and threats and hurting other people. And one of the things, so I have a very mixed relationship with therapists. There's been some we literally, guys, because of the kids and everything, there's been so many therapists in my life. Oh my God, I don't even want to tell you all how many therapists we've dealt with. There's been so many. Some are great, some are horrible. But one of the best ones we ever dealt with said something that stuck with me through my whole life. And she said, what this child wants to do is to make you feel as bad and as crazy as they feel. So that is the reason why they constantly pick at your psyche, is because they are so insecure within themselves and so, shattered, that the only way they feel halfway normal is when you are just as crazy acting as they are, and so for Brian, that's some of what he does with Lauren is, pick at her until she explodes, and then he can look at her and say, see, you're the unstable one. The all of these sorts of things, the violence, the intimidation, Brian is just a very, very insecure guy. And unfortunately, there's nothing anyone external to you can do when you're deeply insecure, no matter how loved you are. I mean, Lauren clearly loves Brian and is super dedicated to him, but this doesn't even begin to fill his shell because he's so empty. And that's the thing with people with this narcissistic personality, no one can fill them. So they're constantly seeking satiation and fulfillment through praise and all of this, but they will never be fulfilled, ever, because the depths of their damage is just too vast, you know. So Brian cannot see or feel Lauren's love, not really, you know. So anyway, so we're moving on. So this whole chapter 6, is from Brian's perspective. So I don't want to reveal too much about what happens between Brian and Lauren, because it's a pretty big spoiler to the plot. Excuse me, but I thought I would kind of move into a little bit of a discussion in this, kind of coming back to religious extremism, by explaining a little bit more about a particular brand of Christian extremism that's actually was developed here in Rochester, Minnesota. Yay! We have a claim to fame. Our very own Francis Schaeffer. We still have Schaeffer Academy here in Rochester. This Francis Schaeffer was a pretty creepy dude. So he started this Christian dominionist version of the religion. And he's fucking crazy, you guys. This is crazy. Okay, here's his deal. He says that Jews are the spawn of Satan and Eve. Interesting. And that, what is it? So they are, mixing together, and that's why they're like, evil. Jewish people are inherently evil, apparently. Literally today, I was parked behind a car with a Schaeffer Academy bumper sticker. Buddy, please. Sorry, everyone. My daughter was supposed to be taking care of the dog. Somehow he's down here barking. I'm not quite sure what happened. So anyway, okay. Don't know what's going on. Anyway, he's left. Yay, but he's gone. So yeah, I was like, oh, Schaeffer Academy, my God. And I want to shout out to my friend Kathy, who pointed out this whole Schaeffer thing. So I'm going to start with reading page 74 about the militia movement. So let's start with that. Militias have been growing across the country quietly for decades. Each group was independent and had their own blend of ideology. The Defenders, that's my militia group, my made-up militia group. The Defenders adopted a Christian dominionist perspective as developed by local resident Francis Schaeffer many years before. Schaeffer's philosophy had anti-Semitism at its core and taught the Jews were the spawn of Satan and Eve. Their hatred extended to all non-whites and anyone not a straight cisgendered male. So cisgendered might be something that people are not super familiar with. Cisgendered just means you were born into the gender you feel like you are. So I feel like a woman. I was born a woman. I am cisgendered. If I felt as if I were transgendered, then that would be the other word. So cis, trans. Okay, so what do we got? Sorry here. When Brian completed his induction ceremony, Stephen proudly handed him a copy of the biblical basis of war as a manifesto for their guiding principles. Stephen explained that they were all sovereign citizens and not required to follow the laws of men, but only the laws of God. The Defenders stockpiled weapons and trained multiple times per week, waiting for this day to come. Random attacks had been common for a long time, and lone wolves were an ongoing threat. Though legalizing the militias was the next step in clearing the nation of undesirables. Brian was drawn to Stephen like a moth to a searing flame. He dominated others in a way that Brian could only dream of doing. Stephen demanded and received unquestioning loyalty. In exchange, he gave his followers validation for their blind rage. It wasn't their fault that they felt less than they should. So I'm going to say that one more time. It wasn't their fault that they felt less than they should. Part of Brian knew full well what they were doing was wrong, but he couldn't let that thought come to the surface. He needed the Defenders, because for the first time in his life, he felt he belonged to something. When Stephen heard Brian talk, he realized Lauren's house was perfect for what they needed. When the Attorney General announced the reinterpretation of the Second Amendment, Stephen was ecstatic to move forward with his plans. So here's a bit of a spoiler, but I played with the Second Amendment to, in this new world, like justify how they were going to legalize the militias. So I'll just tell you that. So, decade on, legalized militia movement, these patriot militia movements. Okay, so this is how I say it happens. The Second Amendment had read, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, ... All the Attorney General needed to do was to unleash, all the Attorney General needed to do to unleash their rage was to metaphorically remove the comma and add a teensy tiny word. He decided that the originalist interpretation of the Constitution had meant a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of the free state. So rather than a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, a well-regulated militia is necessary. So it's a little confusing to read it to you without you being able to read it yourself, so I want to clarify that. Paramilitary groups were given authority above local law enforcement and would answer to the president alone and added to his existing private military force. The Patriot Militia movement had been originally organized under the guise that they would prevent government tyranny. However, once the president came into office, the movement shifted to promoting unfettered presidential power to counter the demands for racial justice. An anti-government, anti-police element lurked throughout the movement as well, and attacks on officers made the profession more dangerous than ever. So I wanted to add that last little bit about police in there. Y'all have probably heard Boogaloo now. So that was a thing I came across last year. And so this Boogaloo movement is, we saw them, I can't remember which of the things that they've been around recently, but they've come into the national news now. They are an interesting movement because, as I explained in the beginning of that reading, all of these patriot groups or all these militia groups, hesitant to call them patriots, but, militia groups are independent. Many of them network with each other online and whatnot, but there's not really a central leadership for them. So they can kind of all do their own thing and have their own little mix of stuff that they've got going on there. And so what we're seeing is somewhat different identities or considered threats. So that was challenging for me to write about. That was actually really challenging for me to write about because, I want to talk about the militia movement in general, but it is a fairly diverse-ish movement in that, one group, like, this Schaefer and these, Dominionist Christians, they might be vehemently anti-Semitic, but then, of course, most of them are anti-Semitic, let's just be honest. But a few, like, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, they're Jewish, and so few actually kind of are okay with Jews as long as they're like sufficiently horrible to everybody else. And actually, Stephen Miller is Jewish also, and Stephen Miller is the inspiration for the name Stephen. So my own dear father was named Stephen, but it was a PH, and I was hesitant a little bit to use that name for this horrible man. So Stephen is the leader of the Defenders. But I wanted to just give a dig at Stephen Miller because he's just horrible, just awful, awful, awful. So, but you have some prominent Jewish figures in the White House, and it helps provide a fig leaf for the fact that the vast majority of these militia groups and others are anti-Semitic. But there's some nuance there. And then with this Boogaloo movement, some of them are very racist, and some of them actually not so much. Their motivation is more to diminish state power. So they don't have a problem with racial minorities, but they have a problem with cops. They hate cops, and they hate the government. And so, we have all of these different groups kind of mixing and molding and shifting in these very interesting and chaotic ways that I don't know which of their philosophies of hate are going to rise up and going, or if they will rise up and become, kind of the dominant philosophy among them. But at this point, there is fairly common, almost all of them are racist. almost all of them are anti-Semitic. I would venture to say all of them are anti-woman, or at least anti-woman in the sense that, of course they all think they're defending us, they're defending women because we're the fairer sex and we need to be protected and all this business. They don't see it per se as oppression of women, but yeah, they pretty much all are. So there are those commonalities, but then there are those within the Boogaloo movement, in particular the Boogaloo, who would be not racist, but would be terribly anti-cop. And so I think that's been something I've been kind of toying with in my mind of this, phenomena we're seeing right now with the Blue Lives Matter and, we have to protect cops at all costs and all that. And trust me, I am not anti-cop. Okay, I'm going to diverge. I'm going to just go off track for just a second, just to say how fucking tired I am of having my views misrepresented by right-wing friends who I have. I'm so tired of being told to find my news from somewhere else besides CNN. I don't even watch CNN. I'm so tired of being told that I don't care about police officers. It hurts my head. Let me just give you a little background on my view of police officers. So when we were living out in Dodge County, we had, I've written about this, so I guess I feel comfortable, talking about this. My oldest son, he was struggling profoundly with mental health issues and violence, and it was terrifying to live with him. And I was scared for my children, my other children, and it was just generally horrible. I love him, so if Jacob or any of my, I should say his name, sorry, but I guess it's not a mystery who my son is. But, if anyone's seeing this, knows him or knows my family, we have a good relationship now. We've worked through a lot of stuff. He's not a terrible person. Again, circling back to Brian, and these other folks, he's not a terrible person. He has a lot of really, really great qualities, but he was a really frightening person to live with. And the police needed to be called a pretty fair amount. I'm not even sure how many times the police were at my house that last year that he lived with us, probably at least a dozen. And in the course of the years he lived with us, probably quite a bit more than that. And what we were finding is that the social workers kind of had their heads up their asses about what we were dealing with, and they had no clue. And so if any of you want all this background, my other blog, detachedonline.com, has the full story about everything we went through with our son. But essentially, the social workers had no clue, and so we were completely vulnerable, and the police were the only people who could help us in these unmanageable situations. And the police came out, and even though my son is a minority, they never used unnecessary force. They were never unkind. They were respectful to him. They helped our family. I felt, sometimes judged because, people don't understand what's going on. But more than judged, I felt thank God they were there to help us. And I think, all these folks on the right who want to constantly say about, liberals or whatever, that we want to defund the police, get rid of the police, and who's going to protect you if the police come, what all this bullshit, if we get rid of the police. I literally know nobody who wants the police force to go away completely. What we're talking about is reform, and we're talking about sensitivity with training. Most countries in the world, I don't know if y'all know this, but most countries in the world have a much more professional police force where they have a lot more training before they're out on the streets. Now, who would that benefit as well? Would it just benefit us as citizens or minority groups? No, it would also benefit those officers to have more training. And so I think this false dichotomy of you either are for police or you're against police is absolute bullshit, and I'm just fucking tired of that. Anyway, I diverge. So let's get back to Brian and the Second Amendment. So that's what's happened with the Second Amendment. It's been reinterpreted. I include the Attorney General in that passage that I read specifically because I don't think we understand how much power our Attorney General has right now to determine how things are going. Bill Barr is or Attorney General, for those of you who don't know. And he got the job after Jeff Sessions made Mr. Trump very unhappy by following the law. How dare he follow the law? And recuse himself, which means to step aside from an investigation that he would have been inappropriately influenced by, because he has such a close relationship with Trump. And I believe some of the fundraising stuff and things like that, Sessions had some Russia stuff going on. I don't really remember. But in any event, Sessions recused himself, pissed Trump off. Trump got rid of him the second he could. And then another way that I get pissed off is that folks on the right, or Trump supporters, always want to accuse me of like, well, do your research, you don't understand what we think, blah blah blah. Well, I actually listen to a number of conservative podcasts, some of them pro-Trump and some of them anti-Trump, but they've been really fascinating. And one of them was this John Ziegler. He hates Trump. He is so funny. We disagree on like almost everything policy-wise, but we agree that the president is just not a good human. The way he treats people is really horrific, and his policies are horrific. And so this guy John Ziegler liked to say that Trump went and got Bill Barr off the couch in his underwear and dusted him off, got him dressed, and made him attorney general. And that's not too far from the truth, because Barr had been attorney general, I believe it was under the first Bush, perhaps, I don't quite remember, but had been out of public life for decades, when all of a sudden he writes this glowing letter to the president about how the Mueller investigation was bullshit, and next thing you know, he's attorney general. I don't think everyday Americans are tuned in enough to how much power this man has, and how much of what is going on right now is almost a direct result of Bill Barr's complete incapacity to be independent from the president. So historically, the Justice Department was an independent entity, essentially. The president could not just walk over there and say, hey, I want you to prosecute this person, or I want you to do this thing. The Justice Department tried to keep some insulation around itself from political pressure so that they could be considered more legitimate, because unfortunately, if you get too political, you lose a lot of your legitimacy. And so unfortunately, what happened with Bill Barr is he is just a political puppet, and there's virtually no legitimacy to him as an attorney general. However, that man has so much power, so much, and it's terrifying, because he has zero, compunction against doing whatever he wants to do to keep Trump in power. So that was another thing that was, as my terror was mounting that Trump would never leave office, Bill Barr was a big part of that terror, because, the president could want to stay in office as much as he wants, but he needs people willing to make that happen for him and to support him in that quest. And I believe Bill Barr would be very much happy to help him stay in power. Okay, so what else we got with this chapter? We got history and let me just talk about the militia movement for a second too. Just step back. We're hearing about the militia movement more now, but the militia movement has been around for decades. I don't honestly know when they kind of started picking up steam initially, but definitely by the Obama administration, that's when they really, really started picking up. Memberships increased dramatically. The numbers of groups increased dramatically. The amount of stockpiling of weapons and the racial hatred that was running through these groups became deeper. Because again, not just the boogaloo who hate the police and aren't necessarily racist. There are a few militia groups that really do think they're defending the Constitution, that really are trying to be out there, protecting against government tyranny and stuff, and not trying to start a civil war, and not trying to kill a bunch of people. There are some of those, who are a bunch of guys get together, drink beer, and shoot guns. Yes, there are those as well. But, the vast majority of these militias are racist, anti-Semitic, anti-woman, and very dangerous and very scary. And Minnesota has multiples. I don't quite remember, for many years, I was a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they put out their, annual magazine on hate every year, uplifting reading, and they point out geographically, and I think Minnesota has at least 5 or 6 militia groups. Now, SPLC also does include hate groups that are anti-white. So there are a handful of those across the country too. There's a handful of groups that hate white people, hate Christians or whatever. So they would include the other extremist groups. So I know Southern Poverty Law Center is often accused of being like, anti-white or whatever, but no, they track all hate groups because, like sane people, they realize anybody who's crazy enough to want to get guns and like hate people and want to like kill people is not good. Like no matter who it is who you want to kill. I mean, this is just common sense, I would think, but whatevs. Okay, so where are we at? Yes, so the militia movement is very powerful, and it's much more extensive than I think most people realize, in especially different parts of the country. Yeah, I don't know if I need to say much more about that. They're terrifying, though. Okay, so I didn't give a lot of the plot away of that chapter because I think it would just be too many spoilers for the book. I want those of you who haven't read it yet to be able to, kind of still be surprised at a few things here. So the last thing I'm going to talk about tonight is chapter 7. So it's not going to be as long as it was last night. I don't think any of us have the staying power that we had last night. I didn't mean to go for an hour and a half. So in this next chapter, we're back to Lauren's perspective. So, Brian's vastly stepped up his abuse, and Lauren has finally, she's got to get away. So she has gotten away. And she has ended up at a local farmer's house, some friends of the family, and they're kind of helping her stabilize. Of course, she tells them about Brian and Defenders, and and it's a scary prospect to be sheltering someone, but they're brave, and they do shelter her, and they help her out and help her recover, because she has a pretty grueling journey to escape. So it's not, of course, novels and everything happens easily. No, it always has to be like all these trials and tribulations. So she has all these trials to get to this farmer house, and she has a lot of recovery that she needs to do. But one of the things I want to talk about, so she's recovering at this house. I want to talk about a couple different things. So I want to talk about some of the terminology I use in my novel. One of the words I use is trod wife. And I just wanted to, so as Lauren is contemplating her escape, she's like, I suppose I could be a trod wife. And, all these kind of movements have their own language, and trod wife basically means traditional wife. So again, that oppression of women, putting women into a category of that's the only thing that they're good for, is being a traditional wife. So now, ironically, I'm going to give away a little bit here, because I didn't know how to talk about this without giving it away. And that is, we also in this chapter discover that Lauren is pregnant. And I don't think that's, too much of a giveaway, because the name of the chapter is with child. So I think we can presume, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit in the previous chapter. So Lauren is pregnant, and she's at this house. She's finally able to, start healing and recovering. Brian doesn't know where she is. She's completely safe for the moment. And the person who's caring for her is this lady named Rosa, who had been a nurse, and she basically does a pregnancy test and tells Lauren that she's pregnant. And so I wanted to kind of address like pregnancy a little bit for a couple reasons. One, Lauren is struggling with this concept, because she's broken free from Brian. But, when you've been in an abusive relationship, you don't just snap your fingers and one day are gone. I mean, even if you're physically gone, the abuser has been so able to effectively deteriorate your mental capacity that you often are still codependently stuck or trauma bonded to them even after the separation. So Lauren is kind of, when she realizes she's pregnant, kind of going through this like sort of trauma bonding kind of concept with him, like, well, he's the child's father, and maybe I should go back to him, this, whatever. And the caregiver Rosa says to her, well, I'm not so sure you want to do that because women are so vulnerable to being hurt or killed when they're pregnant and when they have a young baby. And I think so. I want to talk a little bit about abortion politics because I haven't talked about controversial enough stuff as it is. So why not? Let's start abortion. So I think that's something that maybe is forgotten just a little bit in abortion politics. Or discussions of abortion or choice is the vulnerability that women experience in a violent relationship or in a frightening relationship or a controlling relationship around pregnancy and having a child. And I'm not saying that's a reason to have an abortion. I guess just to kind of add some nuance to discussion of abortion here. I feel like that's another area where I often get offended that I feel that my beliefs are being misrepresented. I am pro-choice, but I also do believe that there is a lot of moral complexity to abortion, and I think a lot of people do, even if they are pro-choice. I don't think really I literally know no one who's like, let's kill babies, or like that's exciting to kill babies. And that's something that's thrown at folks on my end of the political spectrum quite often, is that we're baby killers who want to kill babies. And that's really painful because I've dedicated my life to taking care of children and to adopting children, that's, putting my life with my values. A lot of folks who are anti-choice, they're not adopting kids. They're not adopting the people who are left behind by multiple social systems that don't really take care of the baby once they come into the earth. So, I find that painful to be told that I want to kill babies or I don't care about babies. And I think, from the perspective of someone who's pro-choice, I think the definition of baby is perhaps part of where the confusion comes in there, because many folks would not describe the growing life inside of a person as a baby until that life can pretty much live outside of the womb. Prior to that, it would not be considered a baby, but a potential life. So that's more my perspective. I don't want to speak for anyone else with their perspectives on the abortion debate, but but that potential life, or that life that's there, still has some moral standing. But I think for me and for many folks, the life of the woman who is carrying that child needs to take precedence over that potential life for a wide variety of reasons. And one of those reasons, in my mind, is that we don't know what that woman is facing with that pregnancy. So if she is in a relationship, maybe it isn't even a domestically violent relationship at that juncture, or like a physically violent relationship, but perhaps it's controlling, perhaps it's emotionally abusive. Perhaps that woman just has the sense that this is a really, really dangerous time for her. That would be one motivation, perhaps. Poverty and health conditions and mental health disorders. There's so many reasons why a woman may feel as if a pregnancy could ruin her, and even carrying the child to term could ruin her. So I think I just want to interject that a little bit for anyone who's anti-abortion who might be watching this, to maybe think about that just a little bit. It's, again, there's no easy answers, and things are nuanced. So in my world, if I were the queen of the universe, birth control would be very widely available, and abortion would be virtually unheard of, because nobody would necessarily have an unplanned pregnancy. This would not be happening. So that's where I would go if I could do it, but obviously I can't. So in this chapter, so Lauren is finding herself pregnant, and she's finding herself terrified. Should she go back to Brian? And Rosa says the stuff like, oh, you're so vulnerable. And then she's even more like, oh, freaked out, doesn't know what to do. And Rosa is an herbalist, like Lauren's father was. And so Lauren, so by this point, abortion is illegal in the country. And also I should point out, part of the way that Lauren couldn't get away from Brian was that laws against domestic violence have been overturned by this point, to where there's no such thing as marital rape, or what happens in a person's home is between a man and his wife, or his woman. And this is one of those things where some people, I think, can I say Amy Coney Barrett again? Will you all vomit if I say it again? I said her name 3 times, the last one. But now with Ms. Barrett on the Supreme Court, we very likely could be seeing the striking down of Roe v. Wade. So I think this is really palpable for us right now. But I think for a lot of people, like, the conception that we could strike down laws against domestic violence is completely crazed. You can't even, don't we all think that's a bad thing? Whatever. But again, most things in my novel have some precedence somewhere in the world, and actually Russia just, I think this last year, overturned laws against domestic violence. So in Russia, men can legally beat their women again. So that's what, in my world, that's what happens to the U.S. is that, men can start beating on the women again, and that's all cool. It's a, man's castle, and it's his private choice as to whether or not he does that. So Lauren had no protection in that respect. And so now jumping back into the pregnancy, her situation again, abortion's illegal, but Rosa's this herbalist and gives her these herbal abortifacients. And basically says, just hold on to it, and Lauren never makes the decision about using those herbs. But she talks about, or I talk about in her mind, the concept of that the herbs, or the capacity to end the pregnancy if she couldn't handle it, was the only thing that kept her sanity. And I think that's a facet of legalized abortion that may also not be well understood by some folks, and that is, I think there's a lot of women who maybe do not get abortions, who've considered an abortion, and ultimately for their own reasons they decide against it, and presumably that's a choice they're comfortable with. But for them to get from the point where they know they're pregnant and don't want to be pregnant to the point where they decide to keep the child and either parent it or give it up for adoption, that's a big gulf in there. So for some women, the fact that there is the capacity for an out, a legal, safe out, if you truly can't handle this, if you really feel like you are going to go insane, if you feel like your partner will murder you, if you feel like you will, everything in your world will fall apart if you have this baby, knowing there's some sort of a safety valve can help a woman stay stable during that time. And it can help her get to the place where she can make the choice to either parent, to give that child life without so much crushing her down. And so I think that's another facet of legalized abortion that maybe is sometimes forgotten in the debate of just how scary and terrifying it can be to be pregnant and not want to be. So that's it. Okay, and then I was going to read a little bit from this chapter here. Okay. So I brought up that some of the language. Oh wait, no, never mind. I don't use it. Okay, so here we go. We're picking up before Lauren has gotten to the place where we were just talking about with the abortion and the people who saved her. So this is just after there's an altercation with Brian and Stephen, and Lauren has made the decision to get away. Gales were tottering the shed and ripping at the boards. Lauren worried that the building would collapse. At least if she killed herself, she'd be in control of how her story ended, she thought. At that moment, she would not allow being trapped in that stinking hovel to be her last memory. As that understanding crystallized, so too did another. She could not be a trod wife. Brian claimed to be protecting her, but what was actually happening? She felt the opposite of being protected. Everything he said was a lie. They didn't want a white ethno-state to bring peace. They wanted to hurt and maim, and their theology was nothing more than a fig leaf for their rage. I can't stay. I can't become one of them. Lauren felt as if the universe had opened a window of opportunity when a strong gust ripped off a chunk of siding, exposing a large hole. Lauren could see debris flying by, and she realized how scared she was to go outside. She screamed as a large branch tore at the hole and made it even larger, and mist began howling inside. This must be a tornado, she thought, as she searched through the hole. Several had torn through the area already that year. The winds were straight, but not as fierce as the derechos that had ripped apart everything in their path often enough. Lauren rubbed her hands together. It was just a storm. She would be okay. Her heart raced as she considered where she would go. When Jack's words came to mind, if you ever need anything. She remembered where their farm was, and if she kept her head, she could get there. Surveying her options, Lauren concluded that if she could just get to the woods and to the trees, they would help break the wind and hide her as she escaped. Lauren mustered every ounce of courage within. She kicked hard at the remaining scraps of wood around the crater and eased out around the splinters. The wind was so powerful that it knocked her down, and pain flared everywhere. Drenched and filthy, Lauren pushed herself to her feet. Lauren felt as if the energy of the storm were electrifying her soul, propelling her forward. Through force of will, she'd make it to Jack's house. She was not weak. She would survive. So I read that little bit in the last section about Brian saying she was weak. So that's a recurring theme in there. Lauren, she's actually a really, really strong person, but, she's accused of being weak by Brian, and people hurting her in her life have made her feel weak. But she's too prideful within herself in some ways to just accept that. She's like, no, I'm not weak. I'm a flawed person, but weak isn't one of them. So, and I can relate to that. So, in any event, I think that's going to be it for us for tonight. This is a little bit shorter. I'm going to pick back up. My plan is to do one of these live feeds to finish off the rest of the novel. So that got us through, I believe, chapter 7. Well, let me look real quick here so I can figure this out. I think I might have accidentally skipped kind of through one chapter here. Sorry, guys, if I did. Nope, I covered it. We covered chapter 7. Yep, so we'll pick up with chapter 8. I'll try to do at least 4 chapters tomorrow also. Again, very similar format to tonight. So thank you, everyone. After I jump off this, I'm going to go through the comments on the feed. I noticed there was some controversy with one of my Trump supporting friends from high school, and liberal friend from homeschooling, from the homeschooling community. I think that was who it was. I'm not sure. And maybe some other things. So, but in any event, I will read your comments. I will address any questions you have and try to quell any controversies that are brewing in the comments section. So that's it for tonight. Thank you for sticking with me here, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.